You know, it might be the max strength Lemsip talking, but Sebastian Vettel and Mercedes for 2025 is actually not a bad idea. No, I'm being serious here. This actually makes a bit of sense. Hear me out. Now, I made a video about Vettel last year, considering options about his future, should he want to come back to F1. Back then, there wasn't really much to go on. He was relatively a recluse, with the only major outings as of then were a little spin during the Festival of Speed, and then doing occasional outings with his Race Without Trace campaign, where he retrofits Formula 1 cars from back in the day with the ability to run on sustainable fuel, and therefore give us an absolute anthem of V8s and V10s, and oh, they are so good. And no wonder, we need those sounds back in Formula 1 again. You remember when Alonso was testing a Renault R25 at Abu Dhabi and no one could get anything done, no interviews were happening because the V10 going around Abu Dhabi for the first time ever was just so distracting, but in a good way, including running around more and more in the car that used to be piloted by Nigel Mansell. But, much like one of Sebastian's heroes, could we see a Nigel Mansell-esque return to Formula 1? And maybe Sebastian Vettel might actually be relatively competitive, emulating one of the inspirations for why he drives under the number 5. Because it's been something that everyone's been talking about lately, and also pegging him with the Mercedes seat. Everyone's saying, who's going to be racing alongside George Russell for 2025? Is it going to be Mick Schumacher? Is it going to be Ocon? Is it going to be Alonso? Or maybe it might be Kimi Antonelli if his test in the W13 goes well, and he goes and ruddy well wins Formula 2 this year. Well, I do think that maybe Sebastian Vettel might be a decent shout for that seat, because put simply, it's a bit of a stopgap, and I think Sebastian would be the only driver that would be okay with the idea of being a stopgap, because it would cure an itch. Do I really think he could come back into Formula 1 and be somewhat good? Well, it's all got something to do with what David Coulthard and Eddie Jordan go on about, and hear me out here, they actually come up with a really good point. When Sebastian has got a good tailwind going and he has the hunger to be competitive, he can still be really good, as we saw in Baku in 2021 when he secured a podium for Aston Martin, their first ever in their new guise as Aston Martin. But David Coulthard and Eddie Jordan also mentioned that sometimes skill is just not enough if you haven't got the hunger to back it up. You could be an absolute whiz when it comes to Formula 1. You could drive the pants out of a car, and on your day, you could be really good. But if you no longer have the hunger and desire to be in the sport, then that skill could probably count for toffee. It would be completely and utterly meaningless because you simply don't care anymore. And that's probably something that is affecting Lewis Hamilton a little bit. His hunger is there, but it's being tested currently at Mercedes, since after 3 seasons, that car is not looking likely to be competitive right at the top right now, so therefore, he is questioning his situation. But now that hunger has been stoked up again by getting a chance to drive for Ferrari, something that he's always wanted to do. And according to some various bits of media, he did joke that back in 2017 and 18, he might have wanted to partner with Sebastian Vettel for a little bit, but that might have easily been a joke. But still, you get the feeling that had Lewis Hamilton not secured that Ferrari deal, we might have seen him retire at the end of this year. But it's true though, you've got to have the hunger to even have a chance of continuing. Or you can be just Kimi Raikkonen and simply not care about anything and just do it because, you know, party time. To Vettel, you could tell that by 2022 he was a broken man after years of struggling with Ferrari, being completely sideswiped by Charles Leclerc, after having experienced the same thing at Red Bull when Daniel Ricciardo stepped up. Couple that with the year of discontent of 2020 when Sebastian found out that his services at Ferrari were no longer required before the season really got going, then you'd be really distraught by that, especially since your desire to bring a title to Ferrari, like your hero Michael Schumacher, failed to materialize. But throughout all of that, Sebastian did conduct himself with good grace. You never really heard him complain, he just got on with the job. Instead, he went off to Aston Martin and tried to emulate in a way what his mentor Michael Schumacher did at Mercedes. Go to a team that is relatively brand new or is looking for inspiration and try and build them up into something more competitive. It did take a while, and it did take a little bit too long for the likes of Vettel, because he didn't get to sample the AMR23. We might have seen Sebastian with a lot more podiums. He would have known what the AMR23 was capable of in the simulator, or at least in terms of the drafts and the designs, but even then, that was not enough to keep him in the sport. And therefore, it just gives you the feeling that Sebastian was just done. And especially since the AMR22, I think, is the only car that he did not give a nickname to. It remained nameless, and that is a huge deal. That Sebastian was just done, because even in his darker days, he gave his car a name. And I don't blame him for not doing that, because the AMR22 to begin with was not a good car at all. So for the last 18 months, he's been relatively quiet. He's occasionally done some public speaking, but for the most part, he's been spending time with his family, working on his motorbikes, and just generally relaxing after having spent so many years on the road. But I do get the feeling now that maybe the family and kids are getting a little bit bored of him being around the house, so they've essentially told him, go out and do stuff, go out and race, just give us some space. You know, cabin fever and all that. It does happen. Seriously, it does happen. We're experiencing that with a newborn right now after 5 weeks. So, okay, what's the next logical step? What could Sebastian Vettel do to try and cure the itch of being in motorsport? Well, it seems quite obvious, and all the options that are laid out before him seem to involve a German automaker. There's the likes of Porsche. Some people tout him to being a consultant or even a driver for Audi, but I personally don't buy into that. Or, of course, there is the plum of driving or getting involved with Mercedes. Ultimately, though, I do think that maybe more likely he might be going in as a special advisor to Mercedes, or some kind of successor to Toto. Since Jerome D'Ambrosio, who was meant to be lined up as the successor to Toto Wolff, has now gone off to another team, Toto is probably wanting somebody to come in and help him out, or maybe sort of move the team over should he want to step back and no longer be the team principal. That's what I think is the realistic option here, but people are starting to really want to see Sebastian Vettel in as a driver, so we're going to talk more about that today. As of now, is perhaps testing his mettle at Le Mans this year, with perhaps the likes of Jota, the customer Porsche team, since he recently tested out a Porsche 963 in Spain with Porsche Penske Motorsport. Now, this makes a bit of sense because Jota has always been flirting with the idea of an all-star lineup with the likes of Jenson Button, Fernando Alonso, Max Verstappen sometimes, and of course Sebastian Vettel, sort of bringing up in the lineup of something that would really spark fancy and intrigue. And it's not like Formula 1 and Le Mans are strangers to one another. Remember, Nico Hülkenberg raced for Porsche back in the 2010s, and he went on to go and win the thing. We've seen Mark Webber at Le Mans, we've seen Fernando Alonso giving it the great guns with Toyota. Then of course last year, Jenson Button with that infamously gorgeous sounding NASCAR. He must have had so much fun driving that NASCAR around the Circuit de la Sarthe. That was so fun to see. All these tiny little prototype cars and this big stonking NASCAR just go roar. It's like, oh, can you tell I really like the NASCAR full speed documentary? That was a lot of fun. So perhaps if Sebastian Vettel tried his luck in a low pressure environment with the likes of a customer team like Jota, this might give him a little bit of a feeling about where he is in terms of his overall fitness, because you do have to be pretty fit to be able to drive a prototype car, as well as being able to get in and out of the car since you have to go in through the window. And then also you have to be really good in terms of stamina because you're not really going to be getting much sleep, and also you're going to be driving in the middle of the night. There are lots of things that can easily go wrong in a 24-hour race, so this would be a really good testing of the water to see whether Sebastian is still right up at the top in terms of competitiveness and fitness. And also, if he even just has fun with it. Unfortunately, he did about 600 kilometers or so at the Aragon circuit, and his opinion of it all was that it was definitely fun. And he's also mentioned that endurance racing has been something that he's always observed from afar and never really had the chance to really dip his toes into. But now, we might see this opportunity of him just dabbling a little bit with world endurance and seeing whether he likes it or not. I do feel like it's a good idea to get behind a world endurance car, especially since the hypercars now are so quick and competitive and so much closer to the idea of a Formula 1 car. They are becoming increasingly relevant whilst also being their own thing. And not to mention, world endurance right now with the hypercar and so many manufacturers coming in because they think it's really popular and it's also a really good piece of machinery. Yeah, this is definitely the right time to get into WEC. And so goes for the case for Sebastian. Or alternatively, he could easily have a terrible time and then decide, nah, I'm good, competitive racing is not for me again. But I sincerely doubt that. We all know that Vettel is a petrol head. He loves anything with a motor in it. So for him to not have a good time at Le Mans, that's practically impossible. Just him even being there would be a life goal met. And who knows, he might actually be quite good at it and he might go ahead and win it, although I doubt it because Jota is a customer team, but you know, stranger things have happened at Le Mans. And he might then decide to go for the Indy 500, the Triple Crown that's been eluding Fernando for so long. And who would have thought it? Fernando we all pegged to be the next one after Graham Hill to get the Triple Crown, and then here comes Sebastian Vettel winning the Indy 500! Oh, what an upset! But the real meat of this video is his connection to Mercedes. or lack thereof, or plenty of. No one really knows right now, because Sebastian Vettel, as we all know, he does have a good sense of humor, so he could be completely and utterly trolling us, playing us up for fools, and just having a little bit of a giggle about it. Or he could be deadly serious, we just don't know. There have been constant rumblings about it ever since Lewis Hamilton broke the news that he was leaving Mercedes, that Sebastian's been talking to Toto and flirting with the idea of returning to Formula 1, but never fully committing to it. And why should he? Because it's so early into 2024. So many things can easily happen. And as we all saw in the silly season of 2022, he was the one to initiate it halfway through in the summer of 2022, when silly season is expected to start, not before the season begins. Sebastian kicked it off in a sensational way by retiring, but he knew when to start it. Since then, he's had multiple journalists coaxing him into a response that would get them the scoop that motorsport craves. What's the next move for the four-time world champion? Have you seen that clip from Sky News with Kay Burley trying to get that word out of Sebastian Vettel, and Sebastian's going like, nah, I see what you're doing. No, I'm just gonna give you the same words. Nice try, Kay. And quite right too. It's far too early to say anything about the second Mercedes seat. No one knows who's going to get it. We can't really see a viable option yet for the second seat alongside George Russell. What would be the point? What would we, Formula 1 and Sebastian, gain from him stepping into the sport for a year with a team that is currently 4th place in the Constructors? Well, about that, I feel like there might be something to gain from this after all. And it might fit the idea of Mercedes quite perfectly, without stomping on the toes of many big drivers. Because, let's be real here, Toto Wolff has been umming and ahhing about the idea of Kimi Antonelli. Some days Toto says, oh yeah, we absolutely have to wait for Kimi to adapt to Formula 2 before we bring him into Formula 1. It might be too early for him to come in, and then eventually it might ruin things for him. We don't want to rush him in. And then the next day he's like, oh, we absolutely have to do something drastic to make sure we're competitive. Quick, let's just get Kimi in the car, put him in the car for Imola, and then see what happens. This is the thing. Toto is just vacillating like crazy, as well as the idea of like him changing his mindset about being optimistic for the future. And then the next day he's talking about punching himself on the nose or something like that. You don't know where you are with Toto, and we certainly don't know where we are in regards to Antonelli's future with Mercedes. So maybe Sebastian Vettel just entering into the fray and putting himself up there for a year might be the cure. It might give Kimi the training that he needs, as well as giving Toto a little bit of a PR boost. But let's talk about that more in detail. Sebastian could fill in the seat briefly, just in case the youngster under Toto's wing isn't quite ready to join F1 in 2025. Supposing he has a howler of a year in F2 if Prema don't get their act together, which so far they're not exactly doing. Not to mention that it might not be that worth it of bringing Kimi Antonelli in for 2025 right when the regulations are about to change. 2026 is a brand new set of regulations, and much like what Kimi's experiencing right now in F2, that's a brand new era. The playing field is relatively level in F2 currently, so maybe it might be good for him to experience that in Formula 1 as well. I can see it going one of two ways. It could make sense for him to be deliberately halted in Formula 2 for another year, so that means he can get some extra training under his belt in a relatively low pressure environment. Or they could bring him in for 2025, so that means he gets to know the operational side of Mercedes, gets to know what a Formula 1 team is like in terms of the day-to-day, and going from race to race, and then in 2026, he can start a brand new set of machinery, and then go from there with a year under his belt in terms of the operational and admin side of things. Again, it all depends on how well Antonelli does in the junior category this year. If he does fairly well, I reckon it would be worth just keeping him in F2 for 2025. But Mercedes might not have any choice. If Kimi Antonelli decides to turn up the wick and goes ahead and wins the F2 championship, he can't stay there, so they would have to bring him in. And then Sebastian Vettel would definitely not be in that seat, because you're not going to kick out George Russell for Sebastian for a year, because then you'll have Russell and Antonelli. Russell's experience training with Antonelli, there you go. Two Mercedes juniors working together in this brand new era of Mercedes, where various sponsors are leaving due to the departure of Lewis Hamilton, but also many other sponsors are coming in. You can definitely tell there is a rejuvenation of that team, which probably might thrive without Lewis Hamilton's pressure underneath it. But supposing Sebastian does step in for 2025, it could be a decent stopgap to allow Antonelli to get another year under his belt competing without the rookie moniker. If he does step in for 2026, Kimi Antonelli will still be under the age of 20, like Lando Norris was when he started. And as for Vettel, if he did step in for a year to give Kimi Antonelli more time in F2, it could be a relatively low pressure encore sort of year. That he can do a victory lap of Formula 1, not having to worry about targets or going for a title. He just get to sample Formula 1 again, maybe at a more competitive team than he was sampling when he was driving for Aston Martin. Sure, Aston Martin and Mercedes right now are relatively level pegging, but the overall scope and facilities of Mercedes are not to be sniffed at, and just the chance for driving with a team that does have some respect from him, and something that he has some connections to with the likes of Mick Schumacher, Michael Schumacher, it might be a little personal goal for him to try out. I mean, sure, the idea of bringing in Fernando Alonso for 2025 alongside George Russell is a decent idea, since those two drivers do get on, even though they had a little bit of a fracas in Melbourne, get the feeling that it would not work, because the future of Mercedes does involve Antonelli if he does impress in F2. And would Fernando Alonso be okay with the idea of him being a stopgap driver? Of course, Fernando is playing the system. He is aware that he is of interest to Mercedes, and he is going to be playing the market. But in reality, I don't see many drivers being okay with the idea of being with Mercedes for potentially 1 or 2 years at most before another driver comes in that Mercedes have been training up for many, many years, not being able to fulfill their own career and desires. And that might put some noses out of joint. Unless, of course, we get the situation where Sebastian Vettel comes in and then he is on equal terms with George Russell or outclasses the Brit, then we might see George's career under threat. We might see Vettel and Antonelli together. That would be a huge upset, wouldn't it? Crikey. And besides, at the moment, I think Fernando has it pretty good at Aston Martin, because in a couple of years' time, they're going to be having a works deal with Honda. And before you say anything about Honda and Alonso not getting on because of those GP2 shenanigans, Honda have publicly said that they are over all of that if they were working with Fernando, they would be cool. There would be no worries about that. Bringing in Vettel, it solves a lot of things, as well as brings in some useful intel from an F1 veteran, as well as gives Sebastian a chance to drive in a more competitive car than the Aston Martin of 2022. And it's not like Vettel doesn't have any idea about how to drive a ground effect car, because again, 2022. And who knows, Sebastian might be okay with just being in Formula 1 for a year and gladly step aside to let some young blood come into the sport that Mercedes have been developing. And also, he might actually be able to give some pointers to the likes of Antonelli. He might step back and be involved with Mercedes as a special advisor, or as an ambassador, much like what Lewis Hamilton was trying to do, be a brand ambassador for Mercedes, be the guy in the cap that goes around races and talks about how Mercedes are so great. Vettel might get that job. But what about the idea of Nigel Mansell in a comeback? Well, Nigel Mansell is a hero of Sebastian Vettel, and in 1994, Nigel Mansell stepped in for Williams in the wake of Ayrton Senna's passing, and proved to not only be good enough to be the partner of Damon Hill, but he also proved to be really, really competitive, since in the first race of his return at the French Grand Prix, he put it on the front row, and in the final race of the season, he went on to win it, in the midst of Hill and Schumacher clashing. Yeah, he probably might have been on the podium, but you gotta be in it to win it, and Nigel was definitely in it, and showed that he still had the speed. But it wasn't an entirely altruistic sort of move. It had something to do with the likes of Bernie Ecclestone, at least according to Mansell. Apparently, Bernie didn't like the idea of a Formula 1 championship with no champions in it. That, in the wake of Ayrton Senna passing, Alain Prost being on a sabbatical at the time, nobody had a world title, and that was something that was not good for PR. So therefore Ecclestone, apparently, got on the blower to Nigel, bought him out of all of his American racing contracts, and Nigel was a little bit surprised by the speedable of it, considering he was really competitive in America. He then came back to F1 and proved to be a dab hand at it, although he did consider it a bit of an emotional experience, driving, as he said, a dead man's car. I don't blame him for that, but it showed that Nigel Mansell still had the speed. But at the same time, though, he was still competing in motorsport, whereas Sebastian hasn't. Sure, Toto Wolff isn't exactly Bernie Ecclestone, but he is a very major player in the destiny of Formula 1, because he is the co-owner of a very major team. And the success of Formula 1 is very much connected to his bank balance and how much the investment in Mercedes is worth. Currently, Toto is viewed as a billionaire. And if Sebastian Vettel were to drive for Mercedes, it would certainly drive up the interest of Formula 1, and thusly drive up the stock price of Liberty Media, and the value of Mercedes, and the value of the sport itself, because, come on, in 2025, you are going to have a huge amount of interest in Formula 1. You're going to have Max Verstappen potentially going for the quintet of world championships, the 5th consecutive world title. Then you'll have Lewis Hamilton driving for Ferrari. Melbourne once again being the season opener, apparently, according to leaks from Melbourne administrators themselves. And then on top of that, if Toto can pull it off, you'll have a returning Formula 1 champion racing alongside George Russell, and that amount of interest in Formula One be astronomically good for the stock price and bottom line of Formula One in the wake of Max Verstappen utterly dominating everything. It would be a shot in the arm. You get another chance maybe if Mercedes get their act together and the W16 turns out to be pretty good. Hamilton and Vettel once again having a little bit of an argy-bargy, as they did in the 2010s. That would be really, really spicy. So I can see the PR appeal of bringing back Vettel, as well as the convenience of just having a stopgap measure. Vettel might be okay with it, he'll cure his itch of being in Formula 1 again, and then he can decide whether or not he wants to stick around, maybe with another team. Maybe he might become some sort of consultant for Mercedes, or he decides to go and work with Formula 1 a little bit higher up. Who knows? It just might be enough to rekindle his passion for the sport, bring in the race without trace stuff, and then we might see an era in 2030 where not only is it net zero Formula 1, but also sounds like a V10 engine. Oh, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. And then in 2026, Toto also gets his dream of having Kimi Antonelli in the car after all, and he's not even 20 yet, and he'll have had some good experience in Formula 2. But in that comes a dilemma, because Antonelli, of course, does have potential, but is he really ready for Formula 1 just yet? That is the quandary that Toto finds himself in. And that's something I talk more about in this video here. Sure, some little bits and pieces are a little bit out of date thanks to Lewis, but I still stand by this argument, so go and watch this next.